Greetings, and welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Ms.Barb Munroe, Chair of Crescent Point Energy, a New York Stock Exchange and TSX-listed company with a market cap of approximately $5 billion on both exchanges. Prior to Crescent Point, Ms. Munroe was Executive Vice President, Corporate Services, and General Counsel for WestJet Airlines from November 2016 until March 2019. Ms. Munroe is also the Assistant General Counsel of Upstream at Imperial Oil from 2008 until 2011, and the Senior Vice President, Legal, IP, and General Counsel / Corporate Secretary for Smart Technologies from 2000 until 2008. Ms. Munroe is also a corporate director serving on the board of the NYSE Corporation, as well as the Alberta Cancer Foundation's Board of Trustees. Ms. Munroe also holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree specializing in finance and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Calgary. She was also admitted to the Law Society of Alberta in 1991 and holds an ICD designation from the Institute of Corporate Directors. Among other things, we discuss a new corporate direction for Crescent Point and reflections on governance from tech to energy. Enjoy. This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast is sponsored by headracingcanada.com. In partnership with four-time Olympian Manny Osborne Parody, headracingcanada.com is now offering free shipping on European factory performance ski gear. By passing brick-and-mortar savings on to customers, headracingcanada.com offers the lowest pricing available in Canada. Check out headracingcanada.com for more info and get your new ski gear for the season. Good morning, Ms.Barb Munroe. Thank you very much for doing this.
Hi, thanks, Trevor. Nice to meet you.
I really appreciate your time, and I know the listeners will too, so thank you. For the listener, just a refresher, after Mr. Craig Bricka, you are the chair of Crescent Point, but for anyone that is listening, what is Crescent Point Energy?
Crescent Point is now primarily an Alberta-based exploration and production company.
You are the chair. It's refreshing to talk to another female leader, so it's nice to get a different perspective. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
To give the conversation structure today, I thought we could break it into two halves. The first part, a little bit about your management style and philosophy, and then we could get into Crescent Point and some current events, if that works for you.
That works for me.
How'd you get into energy?
Well, it's been a bit of a journey. Being born and raised and educated in Calgary, the industry has always been a backdrop. I suppose my first exposure came when I was doing my finance degree at the now Haskayne School of Business. And I was fortunate to pick up a summer job for 3 years in a row with then Dome Petroleum. And that was in the late 80s. And things were pretty good in the oil patch, and summer students were treated exceptionally well. So it was a very positive experience. Through that journey, it reinforced to me that business was where I was most comfortable. I had started out my university experience thinking I wanted to be a dentist. So I spent the first year and a half in the hardcore sciences. And then after my summer student experiences and realizing that the business world was probably some place where I would be ultimately more comfortable, I made the switch in faculties. So that was kind of the groundwork, and I graduated with my BCom 1987 into a recession. The career opportunities that were presented to new grads were in sales. You could sell photocopiers for IBM. They were always on the hunt for good salespeople. Or you could start with one of the big five banks and kind of work your way up. And at that point, I cast further reflection. My father was a lawyer, and I thought, this is probably a good opportunity to continue my education. So I wrote the LSAT and went to law school. And through that journey came out an article at Blake's. So again, lots of client exposure to clients that operated within the sector here in Calgary.
You weren't always at energy companies, if I'm correct.
That's right. So I spent 9 years of my formative legal development at Blake's, took a break to have 2 children in pretty quick succession. And that afforded me another opportunity to reflect on a longer term career. And I returned to Blake's for a short period. And it was then that I was offered the opportunity to move into an in-house role. And it was with a entrepreneurial company, Calgary headquartered Smart Technologies. They were looking for somebody to lead up the legal function and go in as a new member of the management team. So I took that opportunity. The company was then 300 people. Intel was a investor. The company was private. However, with Intel's occupancy of some board seats, the company was run like a public company. So that gave me some good development and exposure to, I think, best practices into the world of governance and into the interesting world of fast-paced technology growth. And when I left Smart about 8 years after I joined, we were up to, I think it was just short of 3,000 employees. We had offices in Germany and in Japan and had penetrated many other international marketplaces. And yeah, I took another break. At that point, it always seems like the macro is driving a bit of my path. It was in 2008. It was the summer. Oil was $150. And within about an 8-week period, the slide happened. And I had some colleagues over at Imperial Oil. And my phone rang and they said, listen, we're looking for your demographic. And I think by that they meant age and experience to come in and help on the upstream side, that there was a near-term pending retirement of one of the assistant general counsels, and they thought that I would potentially be a good successor for that person. So I jumped on board and immersed myself in the upstream side of the oil and gas world. Curl was just then being developed, but I had the responsibility for the upstream portion. So it was Cold Lake, all of the conventional assets in Alberta, and then it was several of the East Coast projects in various phases of development, or in some cases, pause. So there was Terra Nova, Hibernia, Hebron.
If you were to put your finger on one or two skills that transferred from the legal profession over to energy, what would you say?
I think the legal skills that were deployed throughout my career remain relatively constant. It's the managerial and the leadership skills that one takes away from being in different environments and working with people that have different disciplines and backgrounds than my own. I think that's been the biggest contributor to where I sit as a leader today.
So the plan was not to do energy. It kind of evolved.
Yeah, I think it has evolved. I'll touch on that from a diversity perspective. So from Imperial Oil, my phone rang and it was a opportunity to join WestJet as general counsel and to build the legal department effectively from the ground up. There was one other lawyer there at the time, pretty significant operation. So I was pulled back to my exposure to the entrepreneurial spirit that I had experienced at Smart, the fast-paced nature of the business. And I joined. And, you know, I make the remark, so I've had technology exposure, oil and gas exposure, technology back to oil and gas. Now sit on the board of ENMAX. So that's a whole other sector to understanding the electricity power markets. And now as well, a trustee on the Alberta Cancer Foundation with some insights into how the healthcare system works. So all of that is the backdrop to how I define my candidacy and probably attributes and qualifications to be a board chair. It's through that diversity of industry experience and exposure.
Was Clyde Bideau still at WestJet while you were there?
Yes, Clive was chair of the board for most of the time that I was there.
For my own curiosity, what made Clive Bideau so good?
Clive had a long-term vision. Clive, and I say this in a complimentary way, is impatient, as most entrepreneurs are.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the impatience in seeing, I think, at the outset, perhaps a scarcity of a product that he felt he could do better and fill a need. And that was the market that existed on the West Coast for people that were flying to second homes. And then as that grew from a Western Canada base to service more Calgarians that would fly south during the winter. And to do that in a way that was, I think, inclusive to people that ordinarily wouldn't travel. There weren't many frills, and the mantra at the time, and I think it was WestJet's differentiator, because after all, it is a commodity. You're in a tube and you're going from point A to point B. So it's that experience. It's the doing for the guest what some other airlines stumbled on with, bureaucracy or inability to make decisions, and along the way, not to take yourself too seriously, but take your job seriously. And that it was that secret sauce of empowering people to make a difference in people's worlds that I think ignited that spark in Clive, and he motivated people and surrounded himself carefully with people that held that same view. So that was kind of the philosophical part and how it worked. But I think the discipline in that business, because it's a tough business. When I was leaving, I think the average profit margin on a round trip flight was about $11 per guest. So you have to run a tight business. You have to run a good business. And there were several things I think that were, a backbone to that is sticking with a single aircraft fleet type so that your maintenance is known, predictive intervals, and maintaining a strong balance sheet. And WestJet was very good at that, and controlling costs. But when you empowered people and brought them into the opportunity to participate in the profits, it all went around. And that was the success of WestJet for many, many years.
If we were to distill one lesson from Mr. Clive Bideau, what would you say?
Never take your eye off the balance sheet.
Interesting. Well, if we were to fast forward to today, like I mentioned, you're the chair of Crescent Point Energy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
To get into management and philosophy a little bit, if you were to describe your number one priority at Crescent Point, what would you say in the role of chair?
It is the keeper of the relationships, whether they be intra-board relationship, whether it be the relationship between the board and management, or whether it be the relationship between me as chair and Craig as CEO, and to foster transparency and trust in those relationships. That would be what I view as my number one priority as me in the chair role.
Sometimes the best leaders have their own money in the company. Along the way, have you felt it important to put your own money in to create a symmetry of risk with your shareholders?
Yeah, I think that we're cognizant of the share ownership guidelines that we all have. I think our board meets those guidelines.
Mr. Craig Bricka, for example, is probably the top inside owner, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's right.
So that's a good example.
It is a good example, and he's been accumulating those shares for a long, long time as an early employee, for sure.
To keep in Northstar, the company, I guess the number one goal of a company is to create shareholder returns as a business, but sometimes the goals stray, and the job of the chair is to kind of keep the Northstar in sight. How do you do that with your team and with the company in general? How do you think about that to keep things on track?
Yeah, I would say that's been the lion's share role of the oversight function of the board. Really, since Craig took hold in the seat, the board felt that the company needed to transform. And the then board also felt that the management team under Craig's leadership knew what to do. Prior leadership at the company had built an extremely strong management team. Really knew how to pick good people, I would say. And it was time that these people back in 2018 were given that opportunity to show how things might be done a little bit differently. So the company undertook and embarked on the transformation. And it was imperative that that transformation be adhered to and that the management team be disciplined in effecting what had to be done. So, whether you speak to me, whether you speak to the chair of our audit committee or reserves or any other member on the board or any member of senior leadership at Crescent Point, everybody could identify for you what the pillars under the strategy were. And they were really twofold. And one is still in a work in progress. And so we were looking to restructure the portfolio with a view to sustainability, taking a hard look at our assets and saying which assets are core, which assets could be potentially disposed of to fund other opportunities to high grade the portfolio. Enter macro factors such as the pandemic and the parallel mismatch of oversupply and the curtailing of demand, negative oil prices. You throw all that in, that timeline to effect, and the discipline to stay, loyal to that Northstar in the strategy was challenging. But it goes back to, I think the first question that you asked is, as leaders and occupying the top seats in corporations, it's just vitally important that you have ears open, make yourself available for conversations. Particularly to Craig. He was a first-time CEO going through some pretty hard stuff. And I don't know if it's trite to say that it's, it can be lonely as a CEO. You have sometimes 9 or 10 bosses and you have a management team that, looks to you to be the decision maker, and things are ambiguous. As you grow up through the organization, you don't always have all of the requisite information or the luxury of time to make decisions. But if you're dedicated and disciplined, you can work your way through it. And I think to the credit of the management team at Crescent Point, they've been extremely loyal, dedicated, and disciplined to the transformation of the portfolio. And that is substantially complete with the acquisition that was recently announced with respect to the Hammerhead company. And we still now, back to my comments around the balance sheet, we're not uncomfortable with our position, but it's a relative game when you're trying to attract investor dollars. You have to have the strength in that balance sheet in order to sustain dividends and to attract new capital into the company. So that's the focus, is the execution around the integration of the new assets into the company and generating that cash flow to pay our dividend and to pay down some debt.
The roadmap, Crescent Point had a good one for a long time through the 90s, 2000s, and things are going really well. But then things changed and you had to change the roadmap. Nowadays, how do you make sure that the map is right and that it's working? How do you test that from your position?
Yeah, strategy isn't something that's just written on a piece of paper and put away on a shelf. And strategy is a live, iterative process. And, how do we keep that alive? We talk about strategy at every board meeting. It comes up. I think, the challenge is that there are many external voices that are at play in the sector. Sometimes it's call it the ethical superiority of the uninformed that are chirping away at you. And it comes back to discipline in knowing your asset base, not getting caught off. And this is where the board serves an important function on keeping the company within the guardrails. And how do you know it's right? I guess it's just about placing bets, doing your homework. I think at Crescent Point, we've got a very, very strong technical team. We knew the assets that we acquired in the Monney. We knew them inside out because we'd been doing work for many, many years. And so when it comes to competing opportunities, there's a lot of prioritization exercises that go on. So you place your bets where your technical knowledge and your operational know-how tells you that you can probably extract the most value.
If you were to look at the chessboard in the energy business, IP is limited at times because it's shared frequently and there isn't as much as that. But knowing that from your perspective, how do you create the most value? What to you generates the most value at an energy company, knowing that the chessboard is pretty widely studied? How do you create value for shareholders?
Mm-hmm. Again, it gets back to knowing your assets and how you approach your operations. Well spacing is probably a great example of, are you acquiring assets and do you believe that the well spacing is right? Can you imagine doing it in a different way with different technologies? And it's really always comes down to, do you have the right people that think about the problems in the right way? And do you have the expertise, sometimes at the board level, through experience, to press and ask questions? So, when we looked at assets, spacing was always a large question. Or how are we going to do this differently? Can we do this better? But there were some other, I guess, risk-based questions around, parent-child relationships and what experience have some of our board members had in the Permian that would inform that, and asking our people. So it's all of that, but it truly comes back to motivating people and having the right people on your team. And I think that Crescent Point has demonstrated through operational excellence that we have, over the long term, brought in the right people, and a lot of them haven't left. And we've gone through some pretty tumultuous times where opportunities may have looked better elsewhere.
Crescent Point has still got its legacy assets in Saskatchewan, but has been transitioning more to a deep basin style of capital deployments. Is that the reason why you went into the Monney and whatnot?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's all about inventory length and depth and sustainability. We pleased to read a report that was authored by McDaniels last year on the Duvernay and the Montney. I think it was the Porsche and the Ferrari, analysis to the basins that we're currently operating in. And we like our Saskatchewan asset base because, through the water flood and the polymer, that does different things for us with respect to costs, generating cash flow. So you do need some diversity in your portfolio.
The problem is that everybody knows that nowadays. How do you execute in the high value plays on economic terms? Is it through technical expertise, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it is through the technical expertise, and it's also through cost control, because at the end of the day, if you're everybody's looking at cash flow. And so it's having a deep understanding on a full cycle basis of your margin. And so where you see opportunities to reduce costs, you do so. And I think through the last several years, we've seen a lot of companies lean out in that regard.
There's nothing wrong with making money, but some leaders seem to motivate employees more than others and maybe aren't just coin operated, so to speak. From your perspective, what makes a good leader and really motivates employees?
I think bringing employees into the longer term vision of the company. I think having employees understand that when you are a contributor to a publicly traded entity, and that I'm a Milton Friedman subscriber, I guess, is that, the view has to be that the life of the corporation should be longer than the lifespan of anybody working at it at any particular time. Really motivate them to leave the corporation in better shape than they found it. Then the legacy that we leave for others through that value and wealth creation speaks for itself. And when you have employees participate in your equity programs, and it varies where you are in stage of career and whatnot, but if you can demonstrate through other employees that have stayed a long time how they create wealth generation, not only for themselves, but for their dependents and perhaps through other philanthropic efforts that can be motivating and to employees.
Sometimes leaders are forced into one-way decisions and one-way street. But on the flip side, how do you think of it from the perspective of leaving room for if you're wrong and not getting forced into the corner as a leader?
Yeah, I think it's part of a due diligence exercise or any, go, no go funding decision. You always have to talk about off-ramps. It's really part of enterprise risk. When we place this bet, if we're wrong, what is the plan B? And I think that's just part of really good managerial development and having an enterprise-based risk model so that you don't succumb to a one-person decision-maker model, because you can get caught off guard on that because one person doesn't necessarily see all of the risks.
Along the same lines as that is when you take over a company, sometimes the momentum's in your favor and it's easy to keep things going. But how do you balance that with, as a new leader, how do you balance the confidence of taking over with, I guess, some humility that there's room for error?
Yeah, I get this question quite a bit. I think, particularly for people that are moving from maybe the manager level to the director, but they have their eye on a VP role. What does that journey look like? First of all, the information becomes a little more ambiguous. You're not necessarily in the trenches doing the same work that you used to do, and you have to rely on other people to do that work. So you have to become that motivator. Sometimes, in larger organizations, if they've got the luxury, because I truly think it is one, when folks are identified, again, sometimes as early as the manager level, that they've got high potential. What's helpful, albeit scary to the person at the time, is moving somebody into a role where they know nothing about it. So to your question, what does a leader do when they're faced with either a higher leadership position or move to a new group where they don't know anything about the technical aspects of the role, but yeah, they're leading people? You also used the word humility, and I think that's key, is the people that you are leading are the technical experts. And in most instances, people are really happy to talk about what it is they know. And in my experience and in watching others who are successful, leaning on those people and as a new leader going to them and asking them to help you as a leader and to assist you in your understanding breaks down any suspicions and also forces the leader to get away from any tendency, because it's fatal, to BS that you've got the requisite skill set around the technical. You're there to lead people and function, to identify roadblocks, to advocate for your team, to reallocate resources, to identify risks. You're not there to be the technical expert. So if a new leader can avail themselves of their team's expertise, I think they have a pretty high chance of being successful.
Well, that's a lot about you and your philosophy. Maybe we can transition to Crescent Point as a company a little bit.
Sure.
And a few questions from Twitter, if that's all right.
Yeah.
First one being, to rewind back to November 2023, the Hammerhead energy deal. The market didn't react favorably to that announcement. So I guess the question is, why, from your perspective, was that the reaction?
Yeah, I think that the market reaction was it was caught up in timing. And so, the bought deal, I think, was, not as well received as we had hoped. And we felt that we were caught up in a bit of a downdraft on that. Having said that, those things to me are relatively short term in nature when you look at the opportunity that those assets present by way of contribution to long-term cash flow and profitability. So there was that. I think some people were not liking that we took on more debt with the transaction. We had lots of debate about that, both with the management team and among the board. And again, I think that the decision to proceed with the transaction, it's always interesting looking at these things without all the facts and without being in the seat and through backwards lenses, is you don't always have control around the timing of when deals come forward. Hammerhead wasn't in a process. And we knew that if we didn't consummate this transaction within the bounds that we said were palatable to the company, it was likely that that wouldn't have closed and we would be into a far more public process and maybe not have been successful with those assets. We so strongly believe in the fundamentals of those assets that we were prepared within the bounds that we had accepted on the basis of looking at the balance sheet and what we thought we could manage, that we had to proceed with the transaction. We hold that view today. I guess I'm relatively dismissive of short-term critics because as a board member and chair of the board, I got a longer-term view for the profitability and what this company will be.
To get into the weeds, what is long-term? Are we talking 3-4 years?
Yeah, I would say 3.5 to 5.
Given the current weakness in the share price, how does that affect the return of capital strategy for Crescent Point? Does it change your buyback strategy, for instance? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think, we've got a return of capital framework. We have lived through the pain of a dividend cut in the corporation's history. And so when we were able to reintroduce the dividend, we put a framework in place, and that framework is tested down to, call it the 50-ish on oil. There's always a debate as to that's the sustaining dividend. Then there's choices with respect to your return of capital and where does it go? Does it go to special dividends? Does it go to share buybacks? And in our case, we've got to put some of the money back to the balance sheet. So in the near term, our focus is on the balance sheet. And I would say share buybacks remain the more favorable over a special dividend. We believe that Crescent Point standalone is got a tremendous trajectory to be a very strong, profitable company.
Another one from Twitter. Conventional oil companies balancing shareholder returns and reserve management compared to the heavy oil companies nowadays that are moving to 100% shareholder return. How do you think about that in the marketplace for competitive investment dollars? Do you compare yourselves to the heavy oil companies or going down that road, or is it a separate sort of business model?
No, I think that, we look across the spectrum. Given where we are heading by way of size, we have to be cognizant that some of our peers are in that group as we come up the production scale. Capital competes, right? So it's always relative, but investor sentiment matters. And that's the practicality of the decisions that you have to make when you're actually in the seat as CEO and you're a board. If you lived in an academic world, you might not do some of these things because, this says this and that says this. But when you're in a relative marketplace and investment sentiment is leaning in a particular direction, you have to be somewhat responsive to that.
What direction would you say that is pushing right now? Is it
buybacks? Give us all the money back.
Thoughts on the markets now? Where are you seeing opportunities? Is it strictly just capital returns, or are there? I know you can't talk about it, but is it your current basin that you see the most opportunity? And obviously, are you looking around North America?
No, I think that we're relatively settled with respect to the basins that we're in currently, and the opportunity there is to exploit within. So, is there opportunity within those basins for more consolidation? Yes. Is that a priority for Crescent Point? No. Our priorities are those that are stated earlier, with a focus to enhancing the balance sheet as our first priority. I think from a macro perspective, when we look out longer, I'm an oil bull. The energy transition is real, but we need all forms of energy. 100% subscribe to that. And I think when we look around the world, and whether I'm looking at this through the lens of, an E&P company, or whether I'm looking at this through the lens as a director on NYMAX, being in the power business, you look at global demographics, and there are a lot of people in the world that have no energy. And there are a lot of people in the world that are striving to become more wealthy, to bump up to that middle class. And the population demands that energy be part of that equation. So energy is not going anywhere, and it's a question of the mix. And until we see some breakthrough technologies or disruptive technology, I'm not saying that can't happen, but there's a heck of a lot of investment that needs to be made, whether it's into the grid and the resiliency of the grid to be responsive to the growing needs in this changing mix. It's a longer journey than whatever numbers have been plucked out of, honestly, to me, thin air, 2050. We do what we do on a daily basis to deliver on a demand model that we think is robust looking forward.
As the leader of a company that's been through the M&A journey lately, do you see more, I guess, looking out on the markets, do you see more M&A on the horizon? Maybe some of the U.S. companies coming up to Canada? Do you see that happening? Or
I think just from call it the reading that I do and discussions with other people that are involved more closely than I am in the U.S. sector, for sure. And you just kind of have to step back and look at some of the quality of the assets that we have in Canada, the difference in the dollar, the depressed share prices, and then the opportunity, I think, for enhanced egress out of Canada. The U.S. potentially is showing some signs, question mark, around having some regulatory burden that might have otherwise been more heavily colored in Canada. So, for all of those reasons, I think that U.S. companies would be looking north for opportunity. Having said that, Chevron just put their Duvernay assets on the block. So
yeah, exactly. Some people would say that Canadian assets would be a nice snack for a big fish from the States, but yet it hasn't happened.
Time will tell.
Where does Crescent Point go from here? It is start of February 2024. Where is the company looking? You kind of touched on it already, but if you were to leave the listener, where's the company?
Yeah, we're focused on operational excellence. We are heavily invested in bringing and understanding the new assets into production, and driving out costs where we can, and generating cash flow and applying that to our balance sheet. So the focus of the management team is continued discipline to the second pillar of the two strategic pillars that I spoke about that the company introduced in 2018, and portfolio sustainability and enhancement and strength of balance sheet. So it's not super sexy, but that's what we're doing.
Sure. Boring is good for business. To end on a lighter note, what advice would you give to a young female entering the energy industry or business in general from your perspective?
Well, it depends how young they are. I think if they're as young as high school, that they ought to adopt a contrarian view to what's being promulgated as potentially a good career. I think that women entering the STEM functions offers huge opportunity, and Calgary will remain a great city, against which to deploy that education, whether it be in the, call it the broader conventional oil and gas, or whether it's, in the renewable sector, trying to solve some of the problems that we all acknowledge exist, but we just haven't gotten there yet. So I would encourage young people to take a very optimistic view of the opportunities that exist within energy.
Awesome. Well, we can end the formal conversation there. I really appreciate your time, and I know the audience will too. So Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.